All rise. Thank you. Please be seated. We'll be back on the record. It is just after 11 on the 4th of August, 2020 in State v. Daybell. The court took a brief recess so that we could try to work out some of the technology concerns of publishing this exhibit. I note that the witness has left the witness stand. It's my understanding there's been a stipulation that excused this witness at this juncture. There's been admission of the exhibit, and there's also been a stipulation that the exhibit can be published, Exhibit 20. It is my understanding the state is desiring to restart Exhibit 20 from the beginning and to republish. Is that correct, Mr. Rammel?
That's correct, Your Honor.
All right, you may do so.
Thank you, Judge.
We call from and take for an evening at Fremont County Jail. This crime is subject to recording and monitoring. If you don't wish to help, hang up on. Thank you for your time.
Hello.
Are you okay?
So they're searching the property.
The house right now?
Yeah. Yeah. So Mark means will be talking to you.
Okay. What, are they in the house?
No, they're out in the property.
Are they seizing stuff again?
They're searching. There's a search warrant, and so one of them just did on his kids.
Okay.
Yeah, so you tried to set up a call. Glad you called.
Yeah.
So we'll see what transpires.
Okay.
Yeah, don't.
What do you want me to do? Pray.
What?
What do you want me
Yeah,
to
pray.
do?
Well, yeah.
Okay. What can I do for you?
I'm feeling pretty calm. I would call Mark, though, maybe. Just talk with him.
Have you talked to him already?
I did call him, yes.
So he knows what they're doing?
Yeah. It's okay. Call from somebody else I need to talk to. I love you so much.
Okay, I love you. Should I try to call you later?
I don't know. I don't know. You can try, yeah. I'll answer if I can.
Okay.
I love you, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, baby. I love you.
Okay. Love you. Good night.
The court notes that the sound quality was not great on that, but that has been admitted into evidence. The court is going to take the liberty to listen to that outside of the courtroom in preparation of making its ruling. And I may do so on a different device to try and get the sound quality to be better. Any objection to me using that disc to try and get sound quality on a better device, Mr. Pryor?
No objection whatsoever from the defense, Your Honor.
Mr. Rammel?
Nothing from the state, Judge. Thank you.
That concludes the witness The jailer that just testified, Mr. Rammel or Mr. Wood, are you going to call the next witness?
Yes, the state calls Steve Daniels.
Mr. Daniels, does he have a title, Mr. Wood?
Special agent.
Thank you. Special Agent Daniels, if you'll wait right there for just a moment while we clean this witness table. If you'll stand and raise your right arm and face the clerk.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in cause and identity will be the truth, all the truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
You can be seated here at the witness stand, Special Agent Daniels.
Thank you, sir.
You can take off your mask once you've entered that witness cubicle. Special Agent, if you'll make sure to listen to the questions that are being asked, wait for the person inquiring to finish their question before you begin answering, as we're making a record. Mr. Wood, you may inquire when you're ready.
Thank you. Can you state your name and spell it for the record, please?
Steve Daniels, SteveDaniels.
Thank you. What is your occupation?
I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation out of Salt Lake City, Utah.
Okay, and do you have any special responsibilities with the FBI?
I'm the senior team leader for the evidence response team out of Salt Lake City, Utah, and we cover the states of Utah, Idaho, and Montana.
Okay, how long have you been in that position?
I've been the senior team leader for approximately 8 years.
And how long have you worked for the FBI?
For approximately 23 years.
Do you receive any additional training to work on the evidence response team?
Evidence response team members are provided 80 hours of basic training where we learn kind of our general policies, procedures, guidance, guidelines as to how we would handle crime scenes, how we'd process crime scenes, how we would process, execute search warrants, things of that nature. After we receive the basic training, we're then offered advanced trainings. One of those advanced trainings is the Human Remains Recovery course. That's pertinent to this, what we're going to talk about today. That training is currently offered at the University of Tennessee. I've had that training.
Okay, thank you. Agent, what involvement, if any, did you have with the search on the Chad Daybell residence on June 9th and 10th of 2020?
I was the senior team leader, so the team leader was my role at that search of Chad Daybell's property on those dates.
Okay. What did you and your team do in preparation for the search of that property?
Approximately 1 week prior to that search, the local case agent contacted me and let me know that there was going to be a search on the Daybell property. And at that point, we helped develop the search strategy to search the property. And that strategy involved working with the local law enforcement, the local FBI agents, working with our evidence response team unit, who oversees all of the evidence response teams throughout the nation, and then working with our FBI laboratory to develop a search strategy prior to hitting boots on the ground, prior to executing that search warrant.
Okay. And do you and your team have protocols that you follow in a search such as this?
Yes, like I previously mentioned, we do have an 80-hour training that we receive. Currently, that training is received at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and all of our team members take that training, and that's where we learn the different policies, procedures, guidelines that we would incorporate at any of our crime scenes, or if we execute a search warrant, that's where we'd learn those policies and procedures.
Okay. What was the first thing, when did you arrive on the Daybell property?
So on June 9th of 2020, early in the morning is
Okay.
when we would have arrived.
What was the first thing you instructed your team to do?
So in this case, we had a week of preparation, approximately, and I had already assigned roles to all of my team members. We had about 8 ERT team members who responded, and all of my team members already had preliminary roles assigned. Some of those initial steps or roles would have been ensuring that this scene was secure, ensuring that our team was safe, and then starting a crime scene sign-in log to document who was entering the scene, who was exiting the scene. We had a photographer already established. The photographer would have started creating entry photos. For this scene, we'd already established priority areas. So our photographer was already going to start initiating entry photos, starting with the eastern part of the property. And then as my role, the team leader, I have an administrative log or worksheet that I would have started to fill out. And then as the team leader, one of my initial roles that I would do is start conducting a preliminary survey of this crime scene.
You spoke about areas of interest. How many areas of interest did you have when you arrived on the property?
So as part of our preparation, working with the local law enforcement, case agents up here, the FBI laboratory, we had already established, and I'll speak to kind of the priority things that we did. We had satellite imagery, we had telephone ping information, we had one text message in particular that already allowed us to establish some priority areas of interest on the property.
Okay. Your Honor, I would ask that if the state could have State's Exhibit 10 shown to the witness, and if we could put it up on the easel. And it is demonstrative exhibit.
Exhibit 10 will be put on the easel.
Agent, they're going to hand you a laser pointer. Based on what you just testified, can you point out the areas of interest on that exhibit?
So before we even set foot on the property, this is the fire pit area. So from satellite imagery, similar to what this image is, this wasn't satellite imagery, I don't think, but similar to this image, we could tell that there was a fire pit on the property. Based on my experience, we knew before we even set foot on the property that we could potentially find evidence in the fire pit. So prior to even arriving, I had already assigned 2 of my ERT members, once we arrived, to go to that fire pit and assess what we needed to do to process this fire pit. Some of those assessments, once we got there, would be, is today, June 9th, 2020, is the fire pit we see today going to be the same fire pit as we had back in September of 2019? We don't know that, but we need to make an assessment by looking at what type of fire pit are we seeing. Do we see ash outside of today's known fire pit, that ring? Do we see ash around that? We already know going in that we need to process this fire pit because something could have happened here.
Okay.
So that was our priority number 1 area going in without even setting foot on the property.
And what were the other priority areas?
So based on a text message we were already aware of through the investigation, we knew that there was discussion of a pet cemetery. Before arriving, we didn't know where this pet cemetery was. So one of the assessments we had to make once we arrived was, where is the pet cemetery? That was something we knew from a text message. So our job was to try to locate this pet cemetery.
Okay. And were there any other priority areas?
And then we knew from telephone ping information, we had a ping that was on the east side of this pond, somewhere in here, I'd say.
Judge, can I get some foundation on which specific ping information he's referring to, please?
Mr. Wood?
Mr. Dan, or Agent Daniels, were you familiar with the ping information that you were provided? Do you know where it came from?
I would say I'm not familiar with the telephone ping information. So an analyst provided me, told me about the pings. On my evidence response team, I happen to have an FBI analyst who is familiar with the case. And so one of my initial duties was I assigned my analyst who's on my evidence response team, who was familiar with the case. I made her my sketcher. And I basically said, hey, you're the sketcher for this case because you're already involved. Please create essentially a sketch, but it was using some satellite imagery. And please pinpoint for me on this sketch the telephone pings that will be of interest to us as the team. So I can't give you any more detail about those pings. I just assigned the person that I knew was the most knowledgeable about it to give me the pings that we knew would be of interest to us.
Okay. Thank you. So you talked about arriving on the property and your first steps and your priority areas. What happened after you identified those areas? What did your team do?
So essentially the photographer went to those priority areas first, so we could quickly get those entry photos taken of those areas before we did these assessments. Once the photographer covered the fire pit area, we sent the 2 team members I had already assigned to that area because we knew that was a known. We knew we had to search the fire pit. We knew there was a fire pit. So those 2 ERT members automatically went over there after the photography was taken and started assessing that scene. And like already...
Could I inquire a native objection? There's some things that I find are a little confusing to me.
You may.
May I? Officer, you keep making reference to a fire pit and a cemetery. Is the suggestion...
Mr. Pryor, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Can you pull that
I'm
microphone
sorry,
a little bit closer to you?
Officer, you're making reference to a fire pit and a cemetery. Are they at the same location?
The fire pit we could see from satellite imagery.
That's not what I asked you. I asked you whether the cemetery and the fire pit are in the same location.
We don't know where the cemetery is located at this point. We're not boots on the ground. We don't know where the cemetery is.
Okay. But you could see a circular area where there's a fire pit.
Correct, from the satellite imagery.
And that's a circular brick area where there's a fire pit. Is that correct?
So once we arrived on scene, we could tell that there were circular bricks ringing a fire pit. So once we were on scene, we could tell what the fire pit consisted of. We were still trying to assess, and I haven't gotten to the pet cemetery, trying to find where the pet cemetery is.
Okay.
So we'll get to that in a minute.
And Judge, he covered it. I think I'm going to have to clarify this on cross, and I think that's more appropriate. I just wanted a clarification that we're talking about 2 distinct areas, correct?
Correct, eventually, yes.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor.
No problem. Mr. Wood, you may continue to inquire.
Okay. So you arrive on scene and you send out your photographer, correct?
Correct.
And so what did your team do next?
So the photographer starts with the known fire pit area.
Okay.
Once she's taken the entry photos of the fire pit, our 2 members that we assigned to the fire pit start their assessment of the fire pit to determine how we need to process that. The photographer then moves kind of towards that pond, and about that time, we make the determination based on seeing a statue of a dog, and then in front of the statue of the dog, there's what appears to be a grave. And I base that off my training that I've received, my experience of what a grave could look like, a clandestine grave,
Okay.
in front of this dog statue.
And after you and your team make that determination, what do you do next?
So that area where this dog statue is becomes what I call the pet cemetery. And I make that determination based on this dog statue, the possible graves that I identify in front of this dog statue, based on my experience. And then I determined a square, essentially, 10 foot by 10 foot approximately, in that area. And that's what I determined was going to be our pet cemetery area.
Okay. And what did you instruct your team to do at that point?
The photographer continues her entry photos over towards the pond. And these are just entry photos, so just overall photos of this property. And then she continues kind of in a counterclockwise motion around the whole property. Meanwhile, I'm conducting a preliminary survey, trying to assess where this pet cemetery is, trying to locate that. And then the other team members are coming out. 2 team members are going to the fire pit, making assessments on how we're going to process that. Other team members are doing other roles. Eventually, we have, and when I say team members at this point, now we're probably starting to incorporate, it's starting to get beyond the evidence response team. So now we're starting to incorporate other law enforcement officers from Fremont County Sheriff's Office, from Rexford PD. So now law enforcement officers are starting to make assessments, starting to look, inquire around the pond for potential clandestine graves.
Okay. I'm going to call your attention to the pond. Did you and your team discover anything there in that area?
Yes. So eventually what happens is on the northeast side of this pond, near this tree, a clandestine grave is found.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask that this exhibit that's been marked as State's Exhibit 21 be shown to the defense and handed to the witness.
Exhibit 21 will be handed to the witness.
Agent, do you recognize that exhibit?
Yes, that's what I'm going to refer to as the clandestine grave.
Okay. Have you seen that exhibit before?
Yes,
And you're familiar with it?
yes.
Is it a photograph?
It's a photograph that
Did you take that photograph?
I did not.
Did a member of your team take that photograph?
Yes.
And did you incorporate it into your report?
Yes,
And is that photograph a true and accurate representation of what you observed on the ground in that area?
yes, it is.
Your Honor, the state would move for Exhibit 21 to be entered into evidence.
No objection, Judge.
Exhibit 21 will be admitted.
Can you describe what you see in that photograph?
So this is what I would call an overall photograph of what this clandestine grave looked like before we touched it or processed it. What I would describe as a raised berm. So it's a little bit raised in the center of this photograph. And surrounding this raised berm is a thicker vegetation. And then on this raised berm, the vegetation is a lot thinner and shorter. And that's essentially our grave site, what becomes our grave site, and what eventually we're going to call burial site number 1 on a lot of our paperwork.
And so is it all right with you if we just refer to that as burial site 1?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, what did you instruct your team to do at burial site 1 once that site was located?
So once we established the good possibility that this is a grave site, we moved to process this appropriately. And part of that is one of the first processes we want to do is we took photographs, and then we have some special equipment. We have a Faro scanner, and the Faro scanner is what we used for this scene to take measurements. And then we also have a total station, and we use that to take measurements. So the way we want to process this grave site is we want to layer by layer, we want to process this as we excavate down the grave site. And that allows us to kind of tell the story of how this these human remains, how they were buried.
Okay.
And that, go ahead.
Uh, Did you then excavate that site?
And then we started excavating the site layer by layer.
Okay. You say layer by layer. Can you just briefly describe how that process goes?
So for burial site 1, we started by removing this upper vegetation off to get a better picture without the vegetation of what it looked like. And then, I don't know if you want me to keep going, but once we removed the vegetation, you could kind of see that raised berm. And then eventually you could see what looks like stones protruding through the ground.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask that this exhibit marked as State's Exhibit 22 be shown to the defense and then handed to the witness.
Exhibit 22 will be shown to the witness.
Agent, are you familiar with State's Exhibit 22?
I am.
What is it?
So once we've gone down,
Well, don't describe what's in it. Just tell us what it is.
it's a photograph that our photographer took.
Okay. And that was part of a photographer on your team, correct?
Correct.
And is this picture incorporated into your report?
It is.
And is it a true and accurate representation of what you saw on the ground that day?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would move for State's Exhibit 22 to be entered into evidence.
No objection, Judge.
Exhibit 22 will be admitted.
Can you describe what you see in State's Exhibit 22?
So once we've removed the vegetation layer, and as we're starting to go down through the layers of this grave, it's important to start noting these layers for this reason. So now we're starting to see the placement of stones on this grave. So someone's placed stones over this. And so now we're seeing how precise or how these stones are laid. And then you're also seeing roots from the surrounding tree that are cut, showing the effort or showing how this was done. So that's what this picture is really showing.
Okay. And once that was found, did you excavate further?
Yes, and then so once the pictures, the photographs, and the scans are done of this layer, then we would remove those and then continue down.
Okay. And what did you find further down?
And then once these stones are removed, we then come across some thin boards that are underneath this level.
Your Honor, the state's going to ask that this exhibit marked as State's Exhibit 23 be shown to the defense and handed to the witness.
Exhibit 23 is now being shown to the witness.
Agent, are you familiar with State's Exhibit 23?
Yes.
What is it?
It's another photograph that our photographer took.
And were you, your photographer took, was this as a part of your investigation and excavation?
Yes,
And is it incorporated in your report?
it is.
And is it a true and accurate representation of what you saw that day on that site?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would move for Exhibit 23 to be entered into evidence.
And there would be no objection to that, Judge.
Exhibit 23 will be admitted.
Agent, see on State's Exhibit 23.
Yes. So again, part of that process is once we remove those stones, kind of the next significant item is the boards that were underneath the stone. So again, someone's placed these boards over this grave site. And so this is telling that story, the effort somebody went through for some reason to put these boards there. And so that's what we want to capture. So again, photographs, scans are taken, and this is what that next layer or level is. And this is part of that story.
Okay. Do you see tree branches?
And I can
Oh,
still
I'm
get,
sorry. Let me rephrase that. Do you see tree roots?
yes, you can see from this photo, you can still see the surrounding area of the grave and the textures and the roots.
Did you remove those boards
Yes,
and excavate further?
yes.
What did you find as you excavated further?
So as we continue to excavate, the next significant piece, the next significant thing that starts to be uncovered is a black plastic bag. a portion of a black plastic bag that appears to be like a black garbage bag, possible black garbage bag.
And what did you do once you found that?
Once we saw what appeared to be the black garbage bag, we needed to kind of verify, do we have human remains here? And so it kind of fell upon me to get in there, and I took a razor blade and I made a cut to this garbage bag. Prior to making the cut on the garbage bag, I got in there with my hands and I just kind of removed the dirt around the object. And the object was just a, oval shaped object. And the plastic bag was just tightly wrapped, tightly against this oval shape. And to me, it just felt like the shape of a skull.
Okay. Your Honor, I'm going to ask that this exhibit, this is marked as State's Exhibit 24, be shown to the defense and handed to the witness. Agent, do you recognize State's Exhibit 24?
Yes.
What is it?
So that was the black.
Well,
Oh,
please
yes,
don't describe what's in it. Can you just tell us what?
It was the photo.
Okay. And is that a photograph a part of your excavation
Yes,
with your team? And is that incorporated into your report?
it is.
And is it a true and accurate representation of what you saw at burial site 1?
It is.
Your Honor, the state would move for Exhibit 24 to be entered into evidence.
And there's no objection, Judge.
Exhibit 24 will be admitted.
Can you describe what you see on State's Exhibit 24?
That was the part of that black plastic that we initially saw. That was what I got, as close as I could inside this burial. And with my hands, I uncovered that dirt that you can see in this photo. And that was what I was scraping off around that oval shape that just felt like a skull. And that was the plastic black bag that was tightly, up against whatever object was inside.
Okay.
And then I took that razor blade, and in order to even cut through it, I had to pull that plastic bag off of whatever was inside to make a cut. And then obviously I tried to make my cut as gentle as I could, not to disturb any forensic evidence. And then once I made the cut through the black plastic bag, a white plastic bag was underneath. And the white plastic bag, appeared to me to be a possible white garbage bag with diamond-shaped texture to it.
Okay. And what did you do once you found that?
So when then on the diamond or on the white plastic bag underneath, I pulled that one up and I made a similar cut with the razor blade. And then as I cut through the white plastic, that's when the, possible human hair started coming out onto my hands. And that was the point where we determined this is human remains.
Okay. And what did you do after that?
And then after that, the rest of the team continued the excavation of the grave. And then eventually we uncovered the entire body that was wrapped in this black plastic bag with a lot of duct tape, intermingled.
Okay. Once that was, did you remove that black plastic bag and its contents from the ground?
Yeah, once the complete excavation was done, where you could see the human remains wrapped in the black plastic, we can take photographs and scans. The coroner was called in, and a body bag was placed, and then the team removed the body, which was given to the coroner.
Okay. All right. I'd like to call your attention to the area that you've described as the pet cemetery. Your Honor, I'd ask that State's Exhibit 25 be shown to the defense and handed to the witness.
Exhibit 25 is being shown to the witness.
Agent, do you recognize State's Exhibit 25?
I do.
What is it?
It's a photograph that our photographer took.
Okay, and that was, is that incorporated in your report?
It is.
And is that a true and accurate representation of what you observed in the area you've called the pet cemetery?
It is.
Your Honor, the state would ask that or move for Exhibit 25 to be entered into evidence.
No objection, Judge.
Exhibit 25 will be admitted.
Can you describe for the court what you see in State's Exhibit 25?
This is kind of the overall photo of what came to be known for us as the pet cemetery. And in this photo, you can see that statue of the dog. And then right in front of that statue, there was what I would call an area that looked like it was a grave. And then near that grave, there was what I would say were maybe two or three, maybe besides that one, maybe two other areas that looked like they could have been graves to me. I imagined these graves, since it was a pet cemetery, or we thought pets were buried here based off a text message. We, logically figured there could be animals here. We did have an anthropologist with us. And when we started our processing of this scene, I had a team start processing this scene, and we put the anthropologist with that team so that the anthropologist could help them determine the difference between animal or human bones if they found any.
Okay. And how did you then begin processing that site?
So we started with just kind of our assessment of possible graves that we could see there. And then based off that, I created, an area, kind of a square area, 10 foot by 10 foot around those potential grave sites. And that was what we called our pet cemetery area. And then that was the area we initially started excavating. The team that started processing that, kind of similar to burial site number 1, we removed the vegetation, that first layer, to see what we were dealing with. Can we see any, these graves? Can we see, get a better picture of them once that vegetation's moved? And then we started having them using hand tools, try to figure out if they could find animal remains, is what we thought we would find. And they did end up finding 2 sets of animal remains.
Okay.
And that was kind of the first step.
Okay. And then what did you do after that?
After the animal remains were found and moved to the side, we used a backhoe to come in, and the backhoe then excavated that initial, what I'm estimating to be 10 foot by 10 foot area. And the backhoe went approximately 2 feet down after that in that approximately 10 foot by 10 foot area. And we also took for this area and all areas, we have measurements, that we shot in. So we know exactly on this property where that area was. So we know this approximately 10 foot by 10 foot area. We know where that is on the property. We know where burial site 1 was on the property. We know where burial site 2 is on the property, eventually when we get there. So the backhoe started excavating this area.
Okay. And what happened as the backhoe started what happened after that?
So once the backhoe had kind of processed this 10 foot by 10 foot area, gone approximately 2 feet down, the backhoe started to expand from the 10 foot by 10 foot area, going a little bit north. And as that backhoe was expanding from our original 10 foot by 10 foot area, the backhoe uncovers 2 potential vertebrae. And we stop and we have our anthropologist make an assessment on those bones. Are they animal? Are they human? Our anthropologist couldn't make the determination with those 2 bones at that time. As I'm standing there waiting for the assessment to be made from the anthropologist, I caught an odor that I can associate with my experience with possibly being decomposing, human remains.
Okay.
And between waiting for the anthropologist to make an assessment that she can't make yet, and then smelling the possible, odor that I'm familiar with of possibly being decomposing flesh, I made the decision, okay, we're going to stop using the tractor. Let's get the tractor out of the way, and then let's have the team focus on hand tools, and let's see what we come up with right here.
Okay.
This is interesting.
So when you recovered the two animals you talked about, did you experience that same smell?
No, I did not.
Okay. You said you moved on to hand tools. Tell us what happened then.
So as the team was using excavating this area, just a little bit north, kind of at the right of, I'd say, I'm estimating right now, kind of at the north side of our 10-foot by 10-foot original pet cemetery area. We eventually, the next significant thing is we hit a bone, sticking out of the ground, and it kind of leads into some flesh. And at the time, our anthropologists still can't make a determination if that's animal or human. And so the team starts trying to excavate whatever this is. And then eventually we're able to excavate a few pieces. The major piece ends up being a pelvic piece.
And is that something you recognize as being a pelvic piece?
I'll say possible pelvic piece,
Okay.
but I mean, a pelvic piece is pretty familiar to me. So I would say I could recognize it, but I'll say possible pelvic piece.
And what else did you find that day?
So that was significant. These pieces at that time was significant. Once the team, recovered those pieces, based on those pieces that were recovered, the anthropologist.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Okay.
Without testifying as to what the anthropologist told you,
Okay.
did you ask the anthropologist to make an assessment?
Yes.
And what happened in your search after that?
So that was where we stopped processing for the day.
Okay.
So that became we knew at that point we had found human remains. So that was where we stopped processing for the day. That became then burial site number 2. I then made a new perimeter, a new outline of where our new excavation site would be for burial site number 2, based off those remains we just found. And that's all going to be mapped in. So we have the data for this new area. And that's burial site number 2 now. And then that's essentially where we ended for day 1.
Okay.
And then the pieces that were recovered, and those pieces appeared to be burned. Some of them were pink still. So there's a lot of tissue still involved. And then again, it was pieces, so dismembered. And then those pieces were put in a body bag. The coroner was there, sealed up by the coroner, and then removed from the scene. So all human remains from day 1 were taken,
Okay. And to your knowledge, was the scene secured at that point?
Yeah, and then so all general evidence, so besides the human remains, which is what we've been focused on, there was a lot of other searching going on, taking place. All general evidence from the day was sealed up, documented, through our paperwork. And then that was all provided to the Rexburg Police Department. And that was handed off to them at the end of day 1. And then the scene was secured. The local police, Fremont County Sheriff's Office, Rexburg Police Department secured the scene overnight. And then ERT departed late in the afternoon on day 1.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd ask that this exhibit marked as State's Exhibit 26 be shown to the defense and handed to the witness.
Exhibit 26 will be shown to the witness.
Agent, do you recognize Exhibit 26?
I do.
What is it?
It's another photograph that our photographer would have taken.
Okay, and is that incorporated in your report?
It is.
And is that a true and accurate representation of what you observed at what we've called burial site number 2?
Yes. Burial site number 2 in the pet cemetery.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd ask that State's Exhibit 26 be entered into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
Exhibit 26 will be admitted.
And then I'd ask that this exhibit marked as State's Exhibit 27 be shown to the defense and handed to the witness.
Exhibit 27 is being shown to the witness.
Agent, do you recognize Exhibit 27?
I do.
What is it?
That shows burial site number 2. And those are the stakes that I put up to mark the perimeter of burial site number 2 once we had identified the human remains.
Okay. And is that a true and accurate representation of what you observed at burial site number 2?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd move for State's Exhibit 27 to be entered into evidence.
No objection, Judge.
Exhibit 27 will be admitted.
Agent, you talked about, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, how you started excavating, or at some point you were excavating burial site number 2 with the backhoe, correct?
Correct.
And then you expanded your search northward.
Correct.
Is State's Exhibit 27, did you compare that with State's Exhibit 26? Is that spot in 27, is that northward of where you originally started excavating site with the backhoe?
It's kind of right on that border.
Okay.
And so it's kind of hard to tell without looking at the final data from our Faro scanner and our total station. It's kind of hard for me from these photos to say if they overlap
Okay.
or not.
That's
So we kind of need to wait till we see that final data.
okay. Exhibit 27, is that the area where you discovered the bones that you talked about on day 1?
Yes,
Okay.
the bones that were eventually for burial site number 2.
Okay. Now, yes, thank you for burial site number 2. Thank you. And did you resume your search or your excavation on June 10th?
Yes. So June 10th, in the morning, we arrived back on scene, and we would have started a similar process: crime scene sign-in log, entry photos again to show how that scene is at that time. I would have started another for the team leader. I would have started another admin log that I would have filled out, and then another preliminary survey. And then our primary, we had a lot of objectives, but the primary objectives were obviously to finish the excavation of burial site number 2. And I think we were still finishing the processing of the fire pit area. And we haven't really talked about that, but finishing the fire pit area.
Okay. Can you tell the court what you found on day 2 at burial site number 2?
So burial site number 2, it was a little bit more complex for us, I think, but it was the same process. There's a story to be told here at this grave. So we want to do the same thing, layer by layer, noting any significance. The difficulty, I think, for us for this one was the way these human remains were found. So it was kind of this, for lack of a better term, it was kind of a mass of dismembered human remains. Burnt, partially burnt. And so we did the best we could. It was kind of hard to recognize, like, what are we looking at here initially? You know, what is this?
Mhm.
We know there's tissue here, there's organic matter here, and we just couldn't recognize what we were dealing with. But layer by layer, we ended up just excavating all around this mass of human remains. And we ended up excavating all the way around it. And at the very bottom of this mass, we find, this melted green bucket. And then to the bottom, the side of that green bucket, we eventually find a skull. And then to the side of that skull, we find a mandible with some teeth. Those are the significant things that you could finally see and recognize out of this mass.
Okay.
And so the team did the best they could to kind of excavate around this and kind of tell that story. And again, we'd stop every so often, take photos, take scans, and document that excavation process, just like we did at the burial site 1, layer by layer. And then eventually it came to the decision point of, okay, now we need to try to lift these remains out of burial site 2.
What happened when you tried to do that?
So when the team tried to lift the remains, this mass out of burial site 2, it fell apart. So what ends up happening is just a removal of pieces into the coroner's body bag. And then once we get the pieces into the body bag, our anthropologist and the coroner essentially do, as best they can, an inventory of what pieces we have, so that I know, as the team leader, how much more do we need to look for in this grave? Because I don't want to leave at the end of the day with only partial remains and there's something else in there. And so even after the bigger parts of the mass and pieces are removed, the team, we still need to continue, digging out this grave, going further than what the pieces we saw were, sifting. And the sifting operation, we didn't talk about that. The sifting operation happened in burial 1 also. A sifting operation continues in burial site number 2. And we're looking for any other pieces of evidence. We're looking for small pieces of bone, small teeth. So we continue those operations until we think we've got all the human remains, so that we can give get everything out of there. And then one thing that we also did was, even once we finished that process, we used the backhoe to go even deeper and wider at each of these burial locations, just to ensure, we got everything.
Mm-hmm. And did you find anything else at either site 1 or 2 when you did that expansion search?
We did not.
Okay. Thank you. And once all those remains were, you may have already answered this, I apologize if you did. Once those remains were all removed from the ground, what did you do with them?
The coroner would have sealed the body bags, and then the coroner would have removed them from the scene.
Okay. All right, thank you. Agent, was this the first time you had been at the Daybell residence?
It was not.
Okay. When had you been there before?
It was January 3rd of 2020.
What were you doing there that day?
We were assisting the Fremont County Sheriff's Office in a search warrant execution.
And so just to be clear, is the same property in Fremont County, Idaho?
Correct.
Okay. What was your role during that search?
Same role. I was the team leader for that search warrant.
Okay. As the team leader, did you take possession and document any items that you found and seized?
We did.
Okay. Your Honor, the state would ask that State's Exhibit 28 be shown to the defense and the witness, along with State's Exhibit 29.
Exhibits 28 and 29 will be shown to the witness.
I'm going to call your attention to State's Exhibit 28. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 28?
I do.
What is it?
It's an LG cell phone.
Instead of describing the contents of it, just in general, what is?
It's
State's
a
Exhibit 28?
photograph that our photographer would have taken.
Okay, and have you had a chance to review that photograph before?
I have.
And is it a part of a report that you prepared in your role as a team leader in a search?
It is.
Okay. And is that a true and accurate representation of what you saw on January 3rd, 2020?
It is.
Okay. Your Honor, the state moves for Exhibit 28 to be entered into evidence.
No objection, Judge. Thank you.
Exhibit 28 will be admitted.
Call your attention to State's Exhibit 29. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 29?
I do.
What is it?
It's another photograph that our ERT photographer would have taken.
Okay, and is that photograph a part of your report as the team leader?
It is.
And is that a true and accurate representation of what you saw in the Daybell residence on January 3rd, 2020?
It is.
Your Honor, the state moves for Exhibit 29 to be entered into evidence.
And there would be no objection, Judge.
Exhibit 29 will be admitted.
So State's Exhibit 28, can you describe what you see in that picture?
It's an LG cell phone.
Okay, and do you recall where that cell phone was found?
It was in a bedroom of the residence, and it was, I believe we call it bedroom L, which was a southeast bedroom of the residence.
Okay. Is there anything distinct about that photograph?
Of 28, Exhibit 28 specifically? Not really.
Okay. Can you describe what you see in State's Exhibit 29?
It's the backside of the LG cell phone.
Okay. And is it the same cell phone?
Yes.
Okay. And is there anything distinctive that you see in State's Exhibit 29?
Yeah, at the residence, this one was distinctive just because this picture shows the clear bubble case that it had with the heart shapes that were inside of it. And then the cell phone on the back, this one was blue in color.
Okay. And what did you do with the evidence found in State's Exhibits 28 and 29?
This evidence item for us was item 21. So it was packaged by the ERT team. And at the end of the day, I seized the evidence. And then I gave all of the evidence to Lieutenant Joe Powell with the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. And then he took the evidence. And that was at the Daybell residence.
Okay. Your Honor, the state has no further questions at this time.
Court notes that it is 12 o'clock straight up. Mr. Pryor, would you like to proceed with cross-examination after lunch?
Judge, that's acceptable to court. That would be my preference, Your Honor.
We'll do that. We'll take a recess for lunch. We'll reconvene at 20 after 1, and we'll proceed with cross-examination of this witness.
All right. All right.
Thank you. Please be seated. We'll be back on the record. The court just returned back from lunch. The state had finished their direct examination of Special Agent Daniels. We're moving on to cross. Is that correct, Mr. Pryor?
Yes, Your Honor, it is.
Special Agent Daniels, if you want to come forward again, you can have a seat at the witness table. You're still under oath. You can remove your mask once you get there. Mr. Pryor, you may inquire when you're ready.
I guess I want a clarification as to how I address you. Is it as special agent or is it as agent, or how would you prefer that I address you, sir?
Agent is fine.
Agent is acceptable to you?
Yes, sir.
All right, I will try to make a point of referring you as Agent Daniels.
Thank you.
Okay. Agent Daniels, can you give me an idea of how many people were at the scene on the June 9th warrant in terms of law enforcement?
We have a crime scene sign-in log, so I would ultimately refer to that to make that assessment. Just to give an estimation, I would estimate we probably had about 50 law enforcement personnel, maybe up to 100 people.
Was anybody at the FBI designated as the person to watch family members and the residents of the home?
I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Were you the chief officer in charge of all operations at that scene at the time?
No, sir, I wasn't.
Okay, who was?
I was the senior team leader responsible for the processing of the crime scene,
Okay.
not over all operations that day.
Okay. Do you have any idea who was the chief officer in charge of all operations that day?
I guess I probably wouldn't be able to tell you that, no.
Okay. Okay. What's an administrative log?
The administrative worksheet or administrative log is the evidence response team paperwork that I, as the team leader, would be responsible for filling out.
And that's something that you maintain in your possession, is that correct?
Yes, throughout the day, that would be something that I would be filling out.
And ultimately,
There's a chance that I could have another team member or somebody else fill out that log. It doesn't have to be just me, but that would be my responsibility.
and then the safekeeping of that log would be your responsibility?
Again, that could be me. I'd be the primary person responsible for that log, but I could designate another team member to fill out that log. For example, that log is also there's a digital format for that log, which is on a laptop. So if one of my team members was working that laptop, they could be filling out that information on the laptop.
And ultimately, at the conclusion and when the reports are written, that administrative log is something that you refer to and you provided it to the prosecutor, correct?
Yes, at the very end of the day, I would review those logs, and then I would submit that with my report as an attachment to my final report.
Okay, thank you, officer. Thank you, Agent Daniels, I'm sorry. You talked about surveying of the crime scene. There were a number of pictures, a number of photos, a significant number of exhibits, and you described what you called the pet cemetery. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay, now, you described that your dig area was approximately a 10 by 10. Is that what you were saying? Is that the
Mr.
way I
Pryor, I'm having difficulty hearing you again. Can you pull that right in front of you? Thank you.
The crime scene that you described as the pet cemetery, you had noted that there was like a 10 by 10 area. Is that correct?
the area that I described as the pet cemetery, once we were there, my estimation of its size was 10 feet by 10 feet square.
Okay, would it surprise you that that area is almost 20 by 20?
Objection assumes facts, not in evidence.
I'm not offering facts. I'm asking if it would surprise him whether or not the pet cemetery is twice as large as what he's suggesting.
Overruled.
Would it surprise you to learn that that pet cemetery is over 20 by 20?
I designated my own pet cemetery area, so it wouldn't surprise me if somebody else had their own pet cemetery area, no.
And that's what I guess I want to clarify, officer, and I'm not trying to imply that you're being in any way suggesting anything otherwise. You designated an area that you felt was the pet cemetery based on where you thought they should start excavation, correct?
Correct.
But if you're viewing the pet cemetery from the aerial, it would not surprise you that it was a much larger area where the soil had been overturned. Would you disagree with that?
I didn't assess where the pet cemetery was based on any aerial imagery.
Okay. But did you base the pet cemetery of the 10 by 10 as the actual area that was all dug up and where the ground had been at least disturbed
So I made my assessment as to where the pet cemetery was based on my visual observation from the ground, and I determined a 10-foot, approximate 10-foot by 10-foot area. That was my designation.
And that designation was an area within the ground area that you felt was of potential significance, correct?
Correct.
So in reality, the area, there could be ground that expands beyond what your designation is. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay, so in simple terms, the pet cemetery you described could be much smaller than the pet cemetery that's visualized from the air, or in reality, what the actual size of it really is. Would that be fair?
Yes, somebody else's pet cemetery could be
Okay.
larger.
Okay. So when you designated the pet cemetery and you decided to do the dig, you uncovered 2 animals, correct?
That's what I observed, yes.
Okay. And the 2 animals were never identified, is that fair?
I observed the animals to be a dog and a cat.
Okay. And then you mentioned, and you're basing that on your experience of what you think a dog and a cat look like?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you didn't dig up the entire ground around that area, did you?
Not the entire ground, no.
Right. And you mentioned that there were 2 or 3 other areas that could potentially be cemetery areas, close proximity to that property, correct?
Close proximities to what property?
To the pet cemetery.
Within what I called the pet cemetery, there were 2 or 3 potential graves.
Okay. Did you dig all of those up?
Yes, sir. That area was excavated.
Okay. But within the area outside of the pet cemetery where the ground was still disturbed and loose soil was evident, you didn't dig up that entire area, did you?
So the area that I assessed to be visually where I could see what I thought could be graves, that was excavated. Okay. With our data, our total station data and our Faro scanning data, we will know what areas we excavated and what areas we didn't.
Okay. And the area that you determined, and that's what's really important about what you're saying, because there's a distinction. The area that you designated as potential graves doesn't necessarily encompass the entire area where the soil in that 20 by 20 is located, is it?
I don't know what 20 by 20 area you're referring to.
Well, I made a representation that is it possible that the area that you explored, that you're describing as the pet cemetery, you designated how big that area was, but there's a possibility that the area that you're talking about is much bigger than 10 by 10 in terms of the soil that's disturbed in that area. Is that fair?
Objection. He's misstating the witness's testimony.
I'm not misstating anything. I'm asking him, he didn't dig up the entire soiled ground in the area. Is that true?
We did not excavate the entire property. That is true.
Okay.
We excavated the areas that I assessed that I called the pet cemetery and the burial 1 and burial 2 locations.
So you can't tell me to a certainty that there aren't any raccoons in the general area known as that's marked where that headstone is, correct?
I'm not going to be able to tell you if there are other animals buried on any of the other property besides the locations we excavated.
Right. So in other words, the simple answer is you didn't excavate the entire plat of land that was dug up. You excavated what you thought was designated as potential sites for remains. Is that fair?
That's not correct.
Okay, well, why don't you correct me?
Again, we excavated the pet cemetery that I designated. We excavated burial site number 1 that I designated.
Right.
We excavated burial site number 2 that I designated. Okay. Those locations, those specific locations, are going to be documented in the data that our Faro scanner documented. Those locations are going to be documented in the total station data that we collected and documented. That information is going to be provided to you. That information is going to be provided to the prosecutor. From that, we'll be able to make demonstrative exhibits, and you're going to be able to know exactly where those locations are that we excavated on this plot of land.
Would it surprise you to learn that I've been out there a number of times and I observed exactly where you excavated, and it's obviously very clear Would you disagree that you left an imprint when you did this excavation?
I would not disagree.
Okay. Would you disagree with me that there are grounds and pieces of property that have been disturbed, or that are the ground is not solid beyond what you designated as the pet cemetery? Would you agree or disagree with that?
I would agree with that.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. So based on that, with these extra grounds around what you did, what only you decided was what you felt was relevant as far as the pet cemetery, there could be raccoons within that, or a raccoon within that property, correct?
There could be raccoons
Right.
on that property.
Okay. Did you identify any other parcels of the property when you were out at the Daybell residence that also had markings and indications of other pet cemeteries on the property?
I did not.
Okay, did you look in any other places other than the two sites you chose?
So the rest of that property was searched. We conducted line searches of the entire property. We had 5 cadaver dogs search the entire property. So other searches were conducted of this entire property.
Okay. And did the other searches, other than the cadaver dogs, include looking at places where the ground was also disturbed within the 4 acres that were out there?
We assessed all 3 to 4 acres of this property looking for clandestine graves.
Okay.
And we stopped with our burial site number 1, burial site number 2. And once we discovered the human remains in burial site number 1 and burial site number 2, and we recovered those remains, that was where we stopped.
Okay. So you did not go around and I'm interested in the phraseology that you use, we assessed. So I'm not really sure what we assessed means. Does it mean you looked at the ground? Does it mean you looked at the adjoining buildings? What does that exactly mean?
Yes, sir. So in order to conduct a line search, we were essentially in a line and we looked at the ground very systematically, very methodically, and we went back and forth across this property, looking at the ground, looking for indications of a clandestine grave, because that's what we're there looking for.
And explain to me what you refer to. You've used that expression a couple times. What do you refer to as clandestine? Please tell me.
So an instance where somebody or persons are trying to hide human remains in a grave. In this case, an outdoor scene, an outdoor grave, similar to burial site 1, where somebody has hidden the remains of a young boy
Okay.
in burial site 1, and then they've placed stones on top of that body.
Right. And I
a
appreciate
board
that.
on top of
I
that
actually,
body.
officer,
Mr.
Judge,
Pryor,
I'm going to object. It's going beyond the question I asked. He's embellishing and he's adding to his answer. And quite honestly, I'm going to move the court to strike the remainder of his answer as non-responsive.
Your Honor, he asked the question. The agent answered his question. He can't move to strike that.
Judge, I asked him what the definition of a clandestine, and then he took it upon himself to decide to add all of the other facts about what he calls the pet cemetery and the other site. And quite honestly, it was absolutely unresponsive. What the officer is doing is he's trying to add more and more to the answer, and quite honestly, I'm somewhat frustrated with his method of avoiding answering my question and yet getting in all sorts of additional information. So I'd like this witness directed to answer my questions.
Mr. Pryor, you asked, what do you refer to as clandestine? Please tell me. I listened to the witness's answer. It's clear the witness was describing what he referred to as a clandestine grave site. I'm not going to strike that from the record.
Now, you also talked about a fire pit.
Yes, sir.
And in relation to what you described as a pet cemetery, where was the fire pit? Do you have a marker you could mark for me?
Yes. So the fire pit was
Just so
located-
the record's clear, which exhibit do we have on the easel there, Mr. Wood?
That's State's Exhibit 10.
Exhibit 10 is being looked at. It's on the easel. The witness is using a laser pointer pursuant to Mr. Pryor's inquisition here.
So June 9th, 2020's fire pit was located in this area.
Okay, what to the closer to you? It looks like there's some brown ground right to the and I'm not sure of actually the direction that is. behind the house where you pointed to where you're saying there's a fire pit. Why don't you point out where you think the pet cemetery is?
So my pet cemetery that I described, that I assessed and found is right about there.
Okay. Would it surprise you to learn that the fire pit is at least 15 feet from where you're describing the pet cemetery?
That wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Were there any indications that there had been any burning in that fire pit?
Yes, sir. There was ash
Okay, there was ash in.
inside and outside the fire pit area.
Okay. How deep was burial site number 1?
Burial site number 1 was approximately 1.5 feet. And I'm saying approximates here because I would want to wait until we had the scanner data to show the true measurements.
And the depth of the pet cemetery site?
If you're just wanting to know the pet cemetery excavation with the how deep we went with the backhoe.
No, with how deep you went before you recovered the remains.
So the remains, I would say that was burial site number 2, and I would estimate that was approximately 2 feet deep. And again, I would want to wait till we had the Faro scanner data to be more precise.
Now, when you talked about burial site number 1, you made reference to the fact that you observed a garbage bag, and then you removed the soil around that, and you touched the garbage bag. Is that correct? To sort of identify what was in there, correct?
Correct.
And I would assume that you would be wearing some sort of gloves. Would that be fair?
Correct.
Okay. Who was the anthropologist?
I don't remember her name right off. There is a report that she drafted that is attached to my documentation.
Within the pet cemetery.
Mr. Pryor, will you pull that microphone a little
Sorry,
closer
Judge.
to you again?
I'm going to do that a million times. It's very difficult.
It's all right. I'll keep reminding you.
Thank you. Within the pet cemetery, I had an opportunity to go over pictures and observe some of this, and I saw no sign of any ash within the soil. Would you agree?
Objection, testimonial.
There's a question to that I'm leading up to, Judge. I think I ought to give some leeway to do that.
Mr. Wood?
He just testified about what he saw.
Okay,
It's
I'll
not a part of it.
rephrase, Judge. There
Please
was
do.
no ash within the soil of the pet cemetery, was there?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part
There
of
was
that.
no ash within the pet cemetery within the soil, correct?
I didn't observe that.
Okay, thank you. Judge, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pryor. Any redirect, Mr. Wood?
No, Your Honor.
You can be excused from the witness stand. Agent Daniels, thank you for being here today.